The village of St. Lo, Normandy, had long ago traded the thunder of artillery for the gentle lowing of cattle and the rhythmic clinking of cider presses. By the summer of 1995, the scars of Operation Overlord were mostly hidden beneath thick carpets of ivy and meticulously rebuilt limestone walls. For Luke, a young architect who had recently purchased a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of the village, the property was a fixer-upper with a view. For the house itself, it was a tomb of forgotten memories. The structure was a classic longora, a long, low stone building that had stood since the 1880s. It had survived the 1944 bombings by some miracle of physics, though the local legend suggested it had served as a temporary billet for both German officers and, later, American paratroopers. Luke's goal was simple: modernize the kitchen while preserving the original hearth. The work was grueling. The mortar between the stones had turned to a fine, sandy powder over the decades. On a humid Tuesday afternoon, Luke was working in the small, cramped space beneath the main staircase, a dark corner that had likely served as a pantry or a coal closet. As he swung a heavy sledgehammer to remove a non-load-bearing interior wall, the vibration caused a section of the adjacent chimney breast to groan. A single, oversized limestone block, roughly the size of a loaf of bread, shifted forward. It didn't crumble. It slid, as if on a track. Luke paused, his forehead slick with sweat. He nudged the stone with the handle of his hammer. It moved another inch, revealing a dark, rectangular void behind it. This wasn't the result of decay. This was a cachette, a deliberate hiding place carved into the very bones of the house. Reaching into the darkness, Luke's fingers brushed against something that wasn't stone or dirt. It felt like dry, brittle skin. He pulled it out slowly, his heart quickening. It was a bundle of heavy, oilcloth-wrapped packages, tied together with a frayed piece of military-grade parachute cord. As he stepped back into the sunlight of the kitchen, he carefully unwrapped the first layer. The smell hit him instantly, not the damp rot of the farmhouse, but the sharp, nostalgic scent of cheap tobacco, dried mud, and old ink. Inside the oilcloth was a stack of envelopes, their edges yellowed to the color of nicotine, addressed in a frantic but disciplined cursive. The stamps were American, 3-cent purples, and the postmark, though faded, was unmistakable: July 1944. Luke sat on the dusty floor, the sledgehammer forgotten. He was holding a dead man's voice, trapped in a stone wall for half a century, waiting for a renovation that would finally set it free. The limestone block sat on the dusty floor like a hollow tooth pulled from the jaw of the house. Luke knelt before the opening, his flashlight beam cutting through 50 years of stagnant air. This wasn't a fluke of construction or a mason's error. It was a priest hole for a modern age, a precision-carved void deep within the chimney breast where the heat of the hearth would have kept the contents dry, even in the dampest Norman winters. As Luke reached back into the cavity, his hand brushed against more than just paper. He pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a fragment of olive-drab wool, a piece of a soldier's tunic. Inside was a standard-issue U.S. Army Zippo lighter, its silver surface tarnished to a dull charcoal gray, and a small, circular trench mirror made of polished steel. The mirror was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures radiating from the center, reflecting Luke's own startled eyes in a dozen different directions. Then came the centerpiece of the cache, a leather-bound journal, its cover stiffened by age and salt air. Tucked into the leather strap was a fountain pen, its nib still stained with a dried, iridescent blue ink. Luke began to clear the surrounding debris, realizing the compartment had been designed for a quick deposit and a long wait. Beside the letters lay a small silk escape map of northern France, the edges frayed where it had been folded and refolded 1,000 times. There was also a handful of loose French francs from the 1940s and a single, unspent .30-06 caliber round, a heavy brass reminder of the violence that had surrounded this house in 1944. The architecture of the hiding place suggested a frantic, final act. The stone hadn't been mortared back into place. It had been wedged with a piece of folded cardboard, a K-ration box, to ensure it could be pulled out easily. The soldier who placed it there expected to come back for it. He had created a temporary safe for his most personal effects before heading out into the hedgerows of the bocage, likely believing he would return by nightfall to retrieve his words and his maps. Luke laid the items out on a workbench. The contrast was jarring. the modern plastic tools of a 1995 renovation sat next to the weathered, analog relics of a world at war. He felt like an intruder, a ghost from the future haunting a dead man's locker. He realized that the house hadn't just been a shelter. It had been a silent courier, holding a heavy burden of secrets while the world moved on, rebuilt, and eventually forgot the name of the man who had tucked his life behind a loose brick. With the midday sun streaming through the open kitchen window, Luke began the delicate process of cataloging the cache. He wore thin cotton gloves, treating the brittle paper as if it were ancient papyrus. The oilcloth had done its job remarkably well. While the edges of the envelopes were singed with age, the ink remained sharp and legible, a deep, frozen blue against the creamy vellum. There were 6 letters in total, all addressed to a Mrs. Clara Miller, in a small town in Pennsylvania. They weren't the sanitized, censored dispatches typically sent through military post offices. Because these were meant to be hand-carried or mailed later, they contained the raw, unvarnished truth of a man living on the edge of the world. Dearest Clara, the first letter began, dated July 12, 1944. The rain hasn't stopped for 3 days. The mud in these hedgerows is like wet concrete. We move an inch and lose a mile. I'm writing this by candlelight in a cellar that smells of old apples and damp earth. I keep your picture in my helmet liner. It's the only thing that stays dry. Tucked inside the third envelope was the photograph he had mentioned. It was a small, scalloped-edge snapshot of a young woman with a defiant, bright smile, her hair pinned up in 1940s victory rolls. She was standing in front of a white picket fence, holding a small dog. On the back, in a different, softer hand, was written, "Come home to us, Jack. Always, C." As Luke read further, the letters traced a harrowing arc. They spoke of the great hedge, a barrier of thorns and dirt that swallowed tanks whole, and the screaming Memise, the terrifying sound of German Nebelwerfer rockets. But through the tactical descriptions ran a vein of profound domestic longing. Jack Miller wrote about the smell of Clara's pot roast, the way the light hit the porch in autumn, and his plans to build a nursery in the attic when he returned. The final letter, however, was unfinished. It stopped mid-sentence. "If the fog lifts tomorrow, we go toward the ridge. Don't worry about the silence, Clara. It just means I'm busy thinking of." Beside the letters, Luke found a small, leather-bound wallet. Inside was a lock of blonde hair tied with a blue silk ribbon and a folded-up newspaper clipping about a local high school football game. These weren't the artifacts of a hero. They were the anchors of a man trying to pull himself back to a life that was slipping away. Luke realized that for 50 years, these words had been shouting into the darkness of a stone wall. Clara Miller had likely received a telegram, a cold and clinical notice of missing in action or killed in action, but she had never received the pot roast, the nursery, or the final "I love you" that Jack had tucked behind a brick for safekeeping. By the following morning, the renovation of the farmhouse had come to a complete standstill. Luke couldn't bring himself to pick up the sledgehammer again. The weight of the Miller cache was heavier than any limestone block. He knew that simply keeping these letters would be a second act of burial. He needed to find Clara, or whatever was left of the life Jack Miller had been trying to reach. The search began at the local mairie, the town hall of St. Lo. The records were a patchwork of pre-war births and post-war reconstructions, but they confirmed that a Company B, 116th Infantry Regiment, had been billeted in the sector during the brutal Battle of the Hedgerows in July 1944. Military records showed a Private First Class Jack Miller had been listed as killed in action on July 14, 1944, just 2 days after his last letter was dated. Luke realized that a lone architect in Normandy couldn't bridge a 50-year gap across the Atlantic. He contacted a local journalist for West France, who recognized the profound human drama immediately. Within 48 hours, the story of the letters from the wall had jumped from a regional French paper to the international wires. The headline in the Associated Press was simple but haunting: "A voice from the stone. French architect seeks widow of fallen GI." The media frenzy was instantaneous. In 1995, before the dominance of the modern internet, the world still relied on the evening news and morning broadsheets. Television crews from CNN and the BBC descended on the quiet farmhouse, their satellite trucks crowding the narrow dirt lane. Luke found himself standing in his dusty kitchen, holding the oilcloth-wrapped bundle for cameras, explaining over and over again how a loose brick had revealed a ghost. The search centered on a small town in Pennsylvania called Clearfield. Local historians and VFW members there began scouring phone books and cemetery records. The name Miller was common, but the details in the letters, the white picket fence, the dog named Buster, mentioned in a postscript, and the attic nursery, became the keys to the lock. Late on a Friday evening, a phone rang in a small, tidy bungalow 3,000 miles away. A local reporter had found a Clara Miller living in a nursing home on the edge of town. She was 80 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had never remarried. When the reporter asked if she had known a Jack Miller who served in France, there was a silence so long they thought the line had gone dead. "Jack," she finally whispered, her voice cracking across 5 decades. "He told me he'd write. He said I shouldn't worry about the silence." The international media, often criticized for its cynicism, suddenly became a global courier service. The French and American governments fast-tracked a visa for Luke, while an airline offered to fly him to Pennsylvania. The world was collectively holding its breath, waiting to see a letter delivered 51 years after the mailman had originally failed to show up. The reunion didn't happen in a sterile press room or a crowded airport terminal. At Clara's request, it happened in the quiet, sun-drenched sunroom of the manor where she lived, a space filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Luke arrived carrying a small, polished wooden box, a far more dignified vessel than the oilcloth and parachute cord he had found behind the chimney breast. When Luke entered, Clara was sitting in a high-backed wing chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was 80 years old, her hair a soft cloud of silver, but her eyes, the same eyes from the scalloped-edge photograph, were bright with a terrifyingly lucid anticipation. She looked at Luke not as a stranger, but as a messenger from a world she had buried half a century ago. Luke knelt beside her and opened the box. He didn't speak, he simply lifted the first envelope, the one dated July 12, 1944, and placed it in her trembling hands. The room fell into a profound, heavy silence. The only sound was the dry, rhythmic rasp of old paper against Clara's skin. As she traced the familiar, hurried cursive of Jack's handwriting, her breath hitched. She didn't read them all at once. She held the first letter to her face, closing her eyes, as if she could still catch a ghost of the tobacco and damp earth Luke had smelled in the farmhouse. "He was always so worried about the rain," she whispered, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "He hated wet socks. He'd complain about them even in his sleep." When she reached the third envelope and found the photograph of herself with the dog, Buster, she began to weep, not with the jagged, fresh grief of a young widow, but with the quiet, rhythmic release of a woman who had finally been told the end of a story. For 51 years, the War Department's telegram had been the final word. Killed in action. It was a full stop. These letters were the ellipsis, the missing conversation that turned a casualty into a husband again. She read the unfinished sentence in the final letter. "Don't worry about the silence, Clara. It just means I'm busy thinking of..." "He was thinking of the nursery," she said, looking up at Luke. "We had picked out the wallpaper. Pale blue with little yellow birds. He never got to see the sample I bought." The delivery of the letters wasn't just about information, it was about the restoration of a man's presence. For decades, Jack Miller had been a name on a white cross in a cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer. Now, he was a man who loved pot roast, hated the rain, and spent his final hours tucked in a French cellar dreaming of yellow birds. As Luke watched Clara press the lock of blonde hair, her own hair from 1944, against her cheek, he realized that the silence Jack had mentioned was finally over. The brick had been removed, and the voice from 1944 had finally come home. The story of the Miller cache did not end with the closing of a nursing home door in Pennsylvania. After the initial wave of media coverage subsided, Clara and Luke made a joint decision. These artifacts were too heavy for any one person to carry. They belonged to history, but not the kind of history found in dry textbooks. They belonged to the living memory of a world that was rapidly fading. In 1996, a year after the discovery, the items were formally donated to the local historical society in Jack's hometown, with a sister exhibit established at the Memorial de Caen in Normandy. The Miller collection wasn't a display of weapons or maps of grand strategy. It was a glass case containing a rusted Zippo, a cracked trench mirror, a lock of hair, and 6 yellowed envelopes. The impact on the community was profound. Visitors didn't just look at the artifacts, they saw themselves in the reflection of the cracked mirror. The Historical Society saw a record-breaking influx of young people, drawn by the viral nature of the story. They realized that while the big history of World War II was about generals and borders, the true history was found in the unfinished sentence of a boy in a cellar who was worried about his wife's pot roast. "We spend so much time looking at the great men of the war," the Society's curator noted during the opening of the wing. But Jack Miller reminds us that every white cross in France represents a nursery that was never built, a football game that was never attended, and a letter that was never sent. Luke didn't just find paper behind that brick, he found the soul of an infantryman. For Luke, the farmhouse in St. Lo was forever changed. He finished the renovation, but he left the cachette behind the chimney breast open, a small, hollowed-out monument within the walls of his home. He placed a small brass plaque near the hearth, simply stating, "Here, Jack Miller waited for 51 years to say goodbye." Clara Miller passed away peacefully 3 years after receiving the letters. In her hand, according to her nurses, was the small, scalloped-edge photograph of herself from 1944. She was buried next to an empty marker in Pennsylvania, but her spirit, many felt, had already been reunited with a man in the Norman hedgerows. The legacy of the letters continues to inspire forensic historians today. It serves as a reminder that the houses we live in and the ground we walk on are saturated with silent voices. The letter that arrived 50 years late became a symbol of hope, a proof that no matter how deep the burial or how thick the stone, the truth has a way of breathing, waiting patiently for the right person to pick up a sledgehammer and listen.